Well, welcome to the third section of the teacher work sample. In this section, we're going to look at the teaching of the unit and then also how kids did in the assessment area. So here, we're going to look at 8 different or maybe 9 different sections that are going to have you reflect upon your lesson. Kind of talk about how you managed it, how the kids interacted, how they communicated with one another, and then what your results were like on the pretest, on your formative assessments, and then your summative assessments. And we'll ask you to analyze the difference between the pre and post, and in your subgroups, the difference between your 2 subgroups on the formative and the summative assessments to see what differences there were, to give you any insights into how kids did. So let's get started and look at section 3, teaching and learning. The first area that you'll be asked is to reflect upon your daily teaching of each lesson. And here, as you teach, I might suggest that you jot down notes so that you can go back and remember, or that night write that daily reflection. What went well, what was successful, and then what things challenged you, and what you could do to maybe change it next time to make it better. So that's what you do on day 1, day 2, however many days it takes you to teach your lesson. You would kind of reflect upon how things went. Typically, this goes probably multi-pages sometimes, in the sense that you kind of talk about what you did that day, and then what worked, what didn't work, what you plan to change, and maybe give us some insights and maybe why it didn't work or why it did work. So that's reflective, because great teachers are reflective practitioners. They always think about, especially driving home, what went well today and what didn't. And any good teacher will tell you as they were driving home, some days are good and some days just aren't so good. Then second, we'll ask you to look at how you manage the lesson. I always like for you, even though we haven't really talked about in looking at the text, the management system, your rules and routines, procedures. You might list what rules you had, any procedures you used, routines at work, like how you passed out papers and the like, and then how you reinforced your positive and negative reinforcement strategy. So a lot of times good teachers will have a hierarchy of strategies that they use, from simply a pause to eye contact to verbal desist, where you ask a kid to stop, to moving him to another seat, to where you take him out in the hallway and talk to him, to which are all low-level types of things, up to actually send them to their office. But what specific positive strategies did you use to prevent kids from being disruptive, and how did you reinforce that, both in a positive and negative way? Typically, here's what some have written in the past, talking about their procedures, rules, some of the prevention strategies in place, and then they even, in this case, they listed 10 rules. That's quite a lot. Typically, most teachers will have 4 or 5 that are positively written, and then this person put in their discipline hierarchy, which is quite good, from using silence and pause all the way up to having the kids see them after class. So quite a good list of discipline strategies. But kind of write about how you managed your lesson, how what your management plan was like. Then in C, how did the kids interact? What multiple strategies did you provide to motivate kids to interact with the material, to interact with others? How do you gain their interest? What specific strategies did you use? Maybe for ASETs or introductions. And then how did you get them to want to learn, what cooperative learning activities, what Kagan strategies, what even going back to Maslow's 9 strategies that you have used to get kids to interact with one another. And that's what you write about in C, how they became engaged in your lesson. And in D, you'll describe the different ideas that you used to promote student-on-student communication, or teacher to student sometimes. But what questioning techniques did you use? And we're spending quite a lot of time on questioning techniques and discussions in gaming, in the cooperative learning. Sometimes you could even have kids rate themselves using rubrics. But what multiple strategies did you use to get kids to interact with themselves? And then in E, F, and G sections, they're going to ask you about your pre-assessment and your formative assessments, and then your summative assessments. And they're asking you to discuss the results and how you use these results to change the behavior. For example, in the pre-assessment, when you diagnose what they knew, first tell us what the analysis of the results were, and then show what objectives they kind of knew or didn't know, reference it to the learning objectives, and give us an idea of how you use that data to just change or construct the rest of your lessons. Was there any plan to differentiate for specific learners that really did poor on the pre-assessment? Almost the same thing for the formative assessments here. You look at for each of the assessments how they did, in relation, especially in relation to the specific objectives. Were they learning what they intended to learn? Did you have to accommodate or modify based on any of these formative assessments what you were doing with your initial lesson plan? And then did you have to differentiate, change the way, or provide special attention to those kids that didn't do well on these formative assessments? And then under the summative assessment, as you disaggregate the data between the pre and post test, kind of as you write it up, discuss how it related to specific objectives. I'm sure there's going to be a significant difference between the pre and post, but was there anything that stood out? And then in the summative assessment, at the end, did they learn what you wanted to learn? Were there any objectives in that summative assessment that were below 80%, or a certain portion of kids didn't learn? What were you going to do to, if it's way low, what were you going to do to make sure that they did learn that? Typically how they look, they're written a little bit like this, but always connect your discussion to the specific objectives that are being met or non-met, and try to show how that data influenced especially in the pretest, your planning, and then the formative, how you adapted the strategies that you found in the formative assessments. Specifically for the formative assessments, again, it's talking about what objectives were met, what low data influenced your planning, or even high data influenced your planning, and how you adapted based on what you found from these short quizzes or short things that you did as you taught the unit. But then the summative assessments are a big thing. We want to compare the means between the pre and post test. So what you would do you would develop the mean for the pre-test and then develop the means for the post-test and display those for the class and then each of your subgroups. We're not going to ask that you do any t-tests, or unless you'd really like to. If you've taken methods of research, you probably know what we mean, but you don't have to do any statistical analysis between the two to see if it really statistically significant. But based on your post-test where any of the objectives met or not met, so usually 80% is a good gauge. If 80% of your kids got 80% of material right, that's usually what many will term as cutting off points. So basically, to do that, you're in your appendix, you'll be showing the pre-assessment data and the document. In the pretest, what you could do is just say pre and post test, because they should be the same. Now in math, it might be different because you may not even give them the same problems, but you're doing the same concepts. But as much as you can, keep the pre and the post the same. But it lists those, show that in your appendix. And then any formative assessment you used, a rubric for a formative performance assessment, show that in the appendix. And you should probably show the scoring key with it. And same thing, scoring key for your summative. So your appendix will probably be quite long. And then also in the appendix, you're going to show a visual representation of your disaggregated data. And here, and these can be done on Excel spreadsheets pretty easily. But typically you will show your pre and post test data for your whole class, and then your various subgroups or your focal student if you had one of those. And typically they'll look all different ways. You can put them in a pie chart. You can put them in, as you see below, in any sorts of graphs. Sometimes if you're in PE, you're doing data counts. You could even show the data count in a table. So, and again, using those student names. But you will display the summative data in your appendix, not so much your paper. You'll simply analyze it in your paper. So that's the section 3. When we come back, we'll look at section 4, where you reflect upon what you found in the data analysis. See you then.